Today I had a conversation with Norman Ohler. He wrote a popular new book called Tripped, and it's Nazi Germany, the CIA, and the dawn of the psychedelic age. And it's a new history of drugs in post-war America, examining the untold story of how Nazi experiments into psychedelics covertly influenced the CIA research and secretly shaped the war on drugs. He also wrote a book called Blitzed, and drugs in the Third Reich, and a lot of the history of Nazi Germany there. He's also a fictional writer, and I listened to him on a podcast with Joe Rogan maybe a couple months ago, and I reached out to him to have him on the show because he and Joe Rogan went over some of the subject matter of how psychedelics can be used for medicinal purposes, and I wanted to get into more of the shadow side of Big Pharma and their influence on the psychedelic movements. And I think the prerequisite for this podcast would be to either read his book Tripped or go and listen to a conversation with him and Duncan Trussell or Joe Rogan. You'll start to get more of a history of his book that he wrote. I skipped a lot of that and jumped right into asking him questions about how maybe the CIA's nefarious actions from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s have shaped and influenced a lot of the current models of how psychedelics are being pushed into the mainstream. And I'm always curious to see how these programs evolve over time, and to not think that they just go away, but to actually question how maybe nefarious actors are starting to use these tools today to influence society and to create somewhat of a soma over our time, just like Aldous Huxley would say. So we talked only for about an hour, but it was a fun conversation, and I felt like we got into some of the subject matter that I haven't heard him speak to yet. So I hope you enjoyed the episode, and don't forget to rate the show on iTunes and Spotify, and that helps people to discover the show. Enjoy the episode. Norman, thank you for joining me this morning, or it's evening for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to talk and
Cool, yeah.
explore new ideas.
Yeah, I found your work a few months ago, and for some reason I never heard of it before, but I think I heard you on Joe Rogan and dove into your book pretty quickly after that, Tripped, and I liked your perspective on the history of LSD, and it's a subject matter that I've been curious about for probably about 15 years myself, and
Right.
I knew I had a lot of questions for you early on in that podcast with Rogan because you guys covered a lot of ground. And so I thought it would be fun to chat with you. So here we are.
Yeah, I haven't even listened to the Rogan one, so I don't even know what I said, but we can certainly expand on anything you want to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like you started this book off because of your mother's ailment with Alzheimer's. Is that correct? Is that what led you down the path of getting into the research on LSD for a treatment?
Yeah, I came across a white paper claiming of an American company, startup company, trying to develop psychedelic compounds into medicines, and the white paper claimed or talked about the clinical trials that that company had done, suggesting that low dosages of LSD might work against Alzheimer because LSD stimulates the 5-HT2A receptors in the brain, which are the same receptors that Alzheimer degenerates. So I became curious, and I discussed this with my father, who takes care of my mother, and he was a bit skeptical because he's a former judge in Germany, and he actually put people into prison for drug use. So he said, before I give an illegal drug to my wife, I want to know, why it is illegal. Why is it not a medicine in a pharmacy, available in the pharmacies, if it's so promising? So that kind of got me to research the early years, because in the early years you can actually see why it never came onto the market as a normal medicine. What went wrong in the beginning? That was kind of my question.
Yeah, and it seemed to lead you down the path of realizing that the government has always got their hands on these things. Any tool of manipulating or changing consciousness has been used by, different people in power for all of human history. And I don't know if you've come across any of the work from Brian Muraresku, his work, The Immortality Key. It's a fantastic
Yeah,
history book on the history of psychedelics. But
right.
yeah, so I'd love to get into some of that. You started to go down to the archives and you discovered some dark history first.
Well, I went to Switzerland where LSD was discovered. I went to the company that discovered it, Sandoz, which today is called Novartis, and they have a company archive. So I wanted to, yeah, I wanted to see how they reacted to discovering LSD, and then the decisions made on the top level of the company, how what to do with it. So that involved like quite a bit of digging in those archives there in Basel, Switzerland.
Yeah, and did you already have a little bit of research background on this subject matter as far as the MK Ultra and things like that you started to discover?
Well, I kind of knew about MKUltra, like everyone kind of knows about it, but I'd never really seen original documents about it. They're also very hard to find because a lot of it was destroyed by the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
So another task I set myself for this book was to actually, try to find out what facts I can really find or what facts are findable, and then come up with the real story of LSD in the 40s and 50s.
Right. Yeah, and it's a pretty deep and dark rabbit hole once you go into that to that history of the CIA's development post World War II.
I mean, a lot has been written about the CIA's attempts to abuse LSD as a truth drug or as a tool for mind control, but no one's ever uncovered, I guess you could say, or talked about why the CIA had the idea to use LSD. I mean, why? How did this originate? That was kind of what I tried to figure out, and I got lucky on my, I think, third visit to the archives when I looked at the papers of the CEO of the company, because he called the shots. It's not the chemist that decides on the policies of the company, but the CEO basically. And the CEO's name is Arthur Stoll, he's a Swiss guy who founded the pharmaceutical branch of Sandoz in 1917. And his idea back then was to turn a fungus that grows on rye called ergot into medicines, and he was quite successful with it. He developed a few different medicines that made a lot of money, and then LSD was kind of a freak discovery by the company in 38 for the first time, and then but they didn't really know what to do with it in 38 because the mice in the animal experiments didn't react to it. So they thought it's not really working, LSD. But in 43, they tested it again, this time on humans. I mean, the chemist who found it, Albert Hoffman, he tested it on himself. Um, so that is quite known, but what is unknown is that Stoll, the CEO, had a best friend, you could say, like a research buddy. His name was Richard Kuhn, a German biochemist, um, who didn't leave Germany when the Nazis took over. So he was, working with the regime, and his job was to develop biochemical weapons. And the Swiss CEO didn't stop communicating with his old friend just because he was a Nazi. Switzerland was neutral, so they communicated with with the West, and with the Nazis. Like he had no problems telling this his old friend about his ergot research. Actually, Kuhn was quite involved in Sandoz's ergot research. And then when LSD was discovered as this very potent substance on the human mind, also that was communicated to Richard Kuhn, who exactly at that time was looking for what the Nazis called truth drug. So he said, he basically wanted to have some of the material, and I found a letter where he states the reception of half a gram of ergotamine, which is the precursor to LSD. So that's how actually the so the CIA is not the first government agency that was interested in LSD. Actually, it was the Gestapo and the SS, and only because they were interested, then first the American military and then the American intelligence community became interested in it. Like they didn't know anything about it, but when they liberated Germany from National Socialism, they found these test reports done by the SS in the concentration camp of Dachau with psychedelic compounds, and they were interested in it because in 45, when the war ended, a new war started already, which was the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So the Americans thought a potential pharmacological weapon could be useful in that war. And they also wanted to prevent Soviet Union from getting their hands on LSD. So LSD then became a big project actually for the CIA, and that was certainly not good for the development of LSD as a legal medicine.
Right. And it seems like there's quite a few people that understand the nature of the OSS and the intelligence agencies being Operation Paperclip, and we developed our intelligence agencies basically from hiring all of these thousands of different Nazis in our space programs, our scientific programs at large. And so most of our CIA was basically the intelligence that just transformed and turned into the Fourth Reich, in a lot of people's opinion. And so the war
Yeah.
never truly ended. It almost seems like this is a continuation of the same
Yeah.
globalist project. At least that's the theory that lots of people have uncovered over the past years.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I was an exchange student in the United States in 1988, and I was in Florida, and my parents from Germany visited me, and we met a Marine on the beach in Florida, an older gentleman, and he said everything that we know we basically learned from the SS. So the Germans were, because they had developed so many things. I mean, the Nazis were obviously evil and committed the worst crimes in history, but they also did a lot of research, and that the Russians were trying to get at it, and the Americans were trying to get at it. So a lot of scientists then prefer to go to America instead of going to Russia, which I think is quite understandable. It's much nicer to be in the United States in the mid late 40s than to be in Russia. I think, unless you're really a diehard communist, then I guess it's better to be in Russia. But most scientists went to America. Some scientists didn't collaborate and went to prison or even got executed after the Nuremberg trials. But Richard Kuhn, the old Nazi biochemist, the old friend of the Swiss CEO, he collaborated with the Americans, and he told them about the LSD research that they did, and that's how basically the Americans found out about it.
Hmm. It's interesting. And it seems like you have a lot of faith in the medical model that's being portrayed, or at least that's taken off in the last 30, 40 years, especially in the last 10 years, for getting psychedelics to be used for PTSD and for different ailments of the brain, like Alzheimer's, like you're saying. Seems like you seem to have a little bit of faith in this system. And that's where I was listening to you on Rogan, and I thought, man, I don't see it. I don't see how the investors and Big Pharma could be trusted after their track record of destroying millions of lives with even the new drug Ozempic. And there's actual attacks on the FDA, and they fund the food education models, and they teach people to basically be fat, sick, and unhealthy so that they can then also get the reward on the back end. So incentives seem to dictate the nature of things for them. And I could
Yeah,
see
it's
this
really weird.
happening with the psychedelic model too. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on trusting these organizations.
Well, of course, obviously, I don't trust pharmaceutical companies, and I don't trust. Oh, I think it's highly problematic that in America, but also in other capitalist countries, corporations have a large influence on policy making. I think that's when democracies erode, and I think that's what we feel across the board in the West. That's why many people are very skeptical of the democratic process. I think there's a lot of, you know, justified reasons for that. That's why that's why democracy is in crisis right now. That's why the West is in crisis right now. And I think the only way to stop this is to actually regulate business, which is a very un-American idea because it kind of smells of socialism. Um, but I think there's no other way than to regulate big business. It has to be done, and it's usually always done. I mean, capitalism is not a system that is completely like lets businesses do whatever they want. You know, we have a lot of regulations anyhow. We just have to we just have to have the right regulations, I guess. And I think the psychedelic movement is of crucial importance in that equation because it's not just a joke, you know, to legalize psilocybin and LSD. It's actually or MDMA. It actually these compounds are actually helpful to the health of many people. So to not do that and to insist on the old uh, prohibitionist laws that that actually do not come from scientific understanding that these substances are dangerous. I mean, if these substances were very dangerous, we would all understand that they have to be prohibited. But that's not the reason why they became illegal. There's different reasons for it: racism or racial profiling or suppressing of certain movements, like the peace movement in the '60s, which was using LSD. The movement against the Vietnam War. That was so. The reasons for drug prohibition. Also, there's a lot of morally justified reasons. Like it's like con- conservative people would, or like traditionally conservative people would be skeptical towards drugs because it like corrupts the values and all that stuff. So all of that we need to throw away, and we need to look also religious. You know, some religions don't allow drugs. That's it's okay for these religions to not allow drugs, but a state has to be neutral, and a state has to be a rational entity which looks at scientific findings. And to not do that and to put up walls, chemical walls in our brains, like the communists once put up a wall around their part of Berlin. It's just so outdated, but it's
Mm.
still a fact, you know, in our Western societies today. And so I think we do need a psychedelic revolution. Actually, we need to completely change this topic, and that's why I wrote the book
Yeah.
Tripped.
And it's really the war on drugs is the biggest problem. It's not just the psychedelics, but the idea that the state should be telling us what we should do with our consciousness, and to decriminalize drugs and still have the ability to study them would be the ultimate goal. But I don't see that being the case. I see it being more of the people that have the control over the drugs only really give us permission or even the programming and propaganda around how we think about drugs. And right now, the medical model is still somewhat of an authoritarian model for the psychedelic um, as treatment, as a medical model to make money for big pharma. Because you're seeing the hype of them,
Mm.
promoting ketamine as the first drug. Of course, the drug that's highly addictive, but everybody glorifies it as this safe and effective drug, and it's costing people $10,000 for a session. And they're usually using veterans, first responders as the poster child to sell their new treatment that's the miracle drug. But
Right.
it's funny because they use the word psilocybin, but they've stripped the word mushroom out, of course. And you need to go and wear headphones, and you need to have a therapist, and it's this authoritarian model where you need somebody in the room with you to have the best outcome. And at the end of the day, it's never worked out, especially when you dig into the true history of what MKUltra and the government agencies did in the 1960s and 70s, and they're still doing it today with certain drugs. So I just don't trust that giving these people the power is going to work out too good, but that's just my opinion. And
Mm.
I can see that the hype around the psychedelic renaissance, if you call it that, is really just the medical version that they're portraying. And they're
Right.
skimming over a lot of the dark ailments of what can go wrong inside of these models when you put people into hypersuggestible states and you start to amplify whatever characteristics that they're amplifying. And it can be used like Aldous Huxley talked about, which is a distraction, soma. It's like pain management. Get everybody to feel just high enough to keep dealing with the oppressed nature of the situation so that nobody's responsive, reactive, or engaged. So I'm just curious what your
Yeah,
thoughts are on that.
it's a very complicated topic, and I think a politician that would legalize drugs would really have to understand what you were just talking about. And the problem is they usually don't understand what drugs are. So um, I don't really see that it comes from top to bottom. I think it must be like a movement, or it is a movement already. People talk about it a lot, and people are very unhappy about it. And I think we have to just increase the discourse and increase the pressure on politicians to change their mind regarding this subject.
Yeah, which is hard to do when you have big investors that are already tied to these companies.
So what do
Not that
you
I,
think should happen?
well, I think we should have hands off when it comes to cognitive liberty. That's my opinion. And I know that's
Right.
not going to happen because um, controlling consciousness is the name of the game when it comes to propaganda. And getting people to be persuaded in certain ways and to think certain ways is the social engineering game that's went on through all of time, top down.
Right.
And so I think it's so embedded with corruption. We can't even get people to stop talking about Ozempic as a miracle drug when we know there's damages caused by it, or to take some of the sugar ads out of
Mm.
the industry that are being promoted by Big Pharma. Big Pharma owns pretty much every commercial, and
Mm.
every bit of propaganda that's out there. So their interests are so deep and so powerful because of how much money they have. So I don't know that there is. I think it should start roots, grassroots, bottom up. But I think people should start questioning the big, huge organizations like MAPS and stop just sucking down the Kool-Aid that they're promoting, that they're here to help us and that it's all medicine. And because I think it's actually just for profit control. And
That's
I
what
think there's
maps.
MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic
Yeah,
Studies.
no. So you think maps is one of the pharmaceutical?
Oh, absolutely. They're not,
Yeah.
it's not think, it's look at their investors and look at what they've done for the last 40 years and who they're tied to. And there's beautiful humans inside the organization, of course, that care about people, but that's
Mm.
the same as in religious organizations. There's good people inside of corrupt
So why did
organizations.
maps fail now with the FDA?
I think there's a lot of reasons, and I've been hearing different feedback as to why, but there's a lot of issues with their
Mm.
the way they set up their clinical studies, and then there's also a lot of issues with what's went wrong with their clinical trials. A lot of
Right.
nefarious actors that have caused supposed harm during the clinical trials, and they've tried to sweep it under the table and not be held accountable for what's went wrong during those clinical studies. And then they've
Mm.
also got pretty sloppy when it comes to the therapeutic approach. Like they use this Stan Groff transpersonal psychological model, which is a model, but it's
Right.
pretty, whimsy, you know. And you're indoctrinating people. You truly are. If you're putting people in a hyper suggestible state and you think that you're the person that has the overarching approach to how to treat people for, say, PTSD, and you're taking the most vulnerable people in the population and you're putting them into these states, and then you're obviously manipulating the data to fit your model so that you can sell MDMA for $10,000 a pop. And
I always
I just
thought
think it's all
maps.
driven by profit.
I thought always maps were the good guys, but you don't
That's what
think
I
so.
thought. I actually volunteered for them 4 times, and I
Mm.
went to their conferences for the last 10 years, and I thought Rick Doblin was a hero. So believe me, I sucked the Kool-Aid down quite deep for quite a few years. I think a lot of people did.
And when
But
did you change your mind, and what made you change your mind?
when you start to just dig a little deeper, like you did with your book, and you
Mm.
start to go down different rabbit holes and see who and what
Mm.
is going on. So
So you think Goblin is not legit? He's like a trickster, or you think he's being used by the structure of maps and by people behind it? Or,
I always try my best to give people the benefit of the doubt and not get too caught up in the character themselves, but see what the incentives are. And when you
mm,
get yourself, maybe here's my opinion, if I could look at it from the most compassionate and non-judgmental place, which is what is the best approach for me, at least, so that I'm not thinking everybody's just a shyster criminal and they're nefarious. Because
mm,
if it was me and I was in his shoes and I got excited about something like MDMA, which he did, and I think he saw the potential for it, and I think he probably found quite a bit of useful benefit from it when he was young, and
mm,
but also saw a huge potential for it to be profitable as well. And then you get people that start to invest in you, and those people get
mm,
to then direct your behavior, especially when it becomes a really popular subject matter. Like 10 years ago is when it really started to boom. And that's
right.
when a lot of investors have come in and they get to dictate where things go from that point on. So it's almost like you have a gun to your head at that point
So,
financially. And
so capitalism is the problem.
I really don't know that it's that simple like capitalism, but it's the idea that capitalism is built on profit and growth versus like
Mm,
outcomes. Not like
mm,
we're not measuring the negatives, we're just looking at the positives, and of course hiding anything that comes out that would potentially ruin the profit margins.
mm.
Does that make any sense?
Yeah, but where do we stand now? We need something else, but we don't know what it is.
Yeah, I don't know if you've come across like Casey and Callie Means, but one of them was an ex-doctor and she saw the corruption of the medical institutions and went against the grain and started to call those institutions out and say, you know what, this is really unethical, because that's what people need to
Mm,
make a stance for instead of just getting their paycheck and keeping their mouth shut. And then her brother, who's a lobbyist and understands the nature of the funding from the FDA and the food industry, and he's able to articulate and call out Big Pharma's basically overarching investment strategies that keep people eating terrible foods and having behavioral, just like your mother who has Alzheimer's, they call it type 3 diabetes. And they're showing that 90% of it's behavioral environmental. We can change our food, we can change our
right,
behaviors and get rid of that ailment, versus Big Pharma's approach would be no, just keep eating sugar where they make the money. And then also let's create a microdosing solution on LSD where we can, maybe get people or whatever the drug is that they're going to use, keep people hooked on the drug. Not to say that the drug shouldn't be an option.
right.
So,
It's funny how much information I'm getting in the last like months about sugar and carbs. It seems to be slowly rising into the consciousness that those things are actually quite bad for you. Like I
yeah,
completely changed my diet in the last like 2 months, and it's much better.
that's amazing. Yeah, because me and you probably, how old are you? I'm 43.
54.
Yeah, so we grew up in a sugar world where all the commercials just started and it was the food pyramid flipped upside down and, somewhat of a weaponized approach to get people to eat more sugar, more carbs, more processed foods. And guess who's behind that? Big Pharma's investors, and they own that whole
Right.
propaganda machine. And then they make all the money on the diabetic issues and all of the metabolic syndrome issues that
Yeah.
come to play. But
So
yeah,
now we just have to kind of get depressed and
I don't think so. I'm always an opportunist and I see it as awareness, which is why we have these conversations. And
Right,
I think, people start to become aware and that changes our behavior. And on the individual level, I think people can make shifts. You're doing it with your books. You spent hundreds of hours, I'm sure, sitting in it's not a very fun job to sit alone and to write and to try
not
to
really.
put history together for people. But, you're doing your part by trying to investigate this stuff and give people a
Right.
broader narrative.
So I just need now people to buy those books, so I can continue doing them. So thank
Yeah.
you for having me on your show.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And you're writing a new book right now, is that right? Like the history of psychedelics or
Yeah, I mean, um, I'm trying to give an overview, which is also not completely new. You mentioned the immortality code, but it is interesting to look at different uh, eras of history and to see how drugs played their role there. And I think we just need to, as humans, come to a different understanding of who we are and how closely that is actually connected to our intake of psychoactive compounds. So I think that's a worthwhile topic to investigate and write about.
yeah. Have you gotten to speak to a lot of the people that have been in that field for quite a long time, like Dennis McKenna and Paul Stamets, these kind of guys that have?
Yeah, I know a few of them, and I will talk to quite a few for the new book. So that's also going to be fun, actually, to research that and be able to communicate with some very interesting minds.
Yeah, I'm sure
Who
that
do
would
you
be.
think I should talk to?
I can email you a list of people right off the cuff. I would talk to Brian, of course, Muraresku, the Immortality Key, and people he's connected to. I know he talked to Robert Forte. And
Right.
Robert, I was on the phone with yesterday. I interviewed him and I asked him some questions to ask you, but he didn't really have anything. And we had a really bad phone connection, so it was hard to hear him because we were chopping in and out. But he wrote
Right.
a book called Entheogens and the Future of Religion many years ago. And I know
Yeah.
Brian, I think, referred to a lot of his initial work to write that book. But
Yeah. Yeah, I'm in touch with Robert, but we haven't met yet, so that should be interesting.
yeah,
I think he's in Greece.
yeah, one thing about Robert, whether you end up agreeing with a lot of his perspectives or not about the history of psychedelics, he at least was one of the people, back in the day that was tied to Timothy Leary. He was friends with him. He actually went through Gordon Wasson's archives and
Yeah.
knew Rick Doblin quite closely. And he was tied into a lot of the who's who. I think he was friends with Albert Hoffman. And so
Right.
you'll at least get a nice, I think, a bunch of people who you could connect to for your book, which will be great.
Yeah.
Because you're going to be the guy that spends the time to write the book. I couldn't possibly imagine doing that.
Why not? You don't have patience?
I have patience, but I mean, writing is quite a feat, and it's definitely a unique job for certain individuals. I don't think everybody has that gift. So,
Yeah. It's like a skill or a talent
yeah. And you did a
that
nice
I
job
have.
with your book. It was very cleanly written and easy, right to the point.
Yeah, I just think it should have been called LSD for Mom. Don't you think that's a better title?
Yeah, and I think it probably would have been more catchy and,
Yeah, it's much
you
more
know,
catchy.
but it's all good.
Yeah,
And
we're
your other,
working on a documentary, also a TV series, so we're gonna call that LSD for Mom.
oh, are you? Nice.
Yeah.
Well, that'll be
Mhm.
good.
Yeah.
Cool. So have you met Rick Doblin, or do you know the people at MAPS pretty well since you're trying to go this route for the medicinal models?
I have met him at a like a there was we didn't meet on one, but like he gave a talk and I was there, and I know we have mutual friends.
Yeah.
I don't really know him. Um, I was just shocked when that he was so confident that MDMA would, be legalized, and then when it turned out the other way, I just try to figure out why and what went wrong. But
Mm.
yeah, I think MAPS made a lot of mistakes.
Yeah, I think so too. And I always think too, like it's not like the FDA truly cares about the safety and efficacy. I think that they're obviously built on incentives as well. Otherwise, we could look
Yeah,
at the whole underlying reason why I can go to a bar right now and drink, as much booze as I want and eat certain foods, like you said, that can really destroy your body. But all that's legal. Ozempic's legal. So I don't know that they actually truly care about the safety and
I think
efficacy
FDA is a
versus
very
they care about control and funding and
yeah,
reputation.
it's a very mysterious organization, very powerful organization. Would be interesting just to have a book on the FDA or like a documentary, but I think it would be quite hard to research that. But you
Yeah.
probably would find like whistleblowers within the FDA. That would be an interesting project.
Yeah, it sure would be enlightening for people.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, what are you working on right now? Just trying to find more research for this new history book you're writing or putting together.
Um, yeah, basically that's the big new job. So right now I'm kind of testing the style of the book and looking at different chapters and making some experiments with writing. How should I be in the book? How should I be in the book? Should it be funny? Should it be serious? Like what eras do I cover? What research can be done? Like what archives should I visit? It's a big project, and I'm kind of slowly preparing it. I also wrote a travel book for Berlin for a French publisher, which was kind of a fun side job because I am from Berlin. Well, I live there, and so he asked me to write a travel book, which is something I haven't done before. That was kind of fun. Have you been to Berlin?
I went years ago when I was about 25. And so at that age, basically, I just wanted to have fun
Yeah,
and,
fun.
but it was good. I had a good time. And it was funny because you go to a bar there and it doesn't really even get busy until about midnight or something. I'm like, by
Yeah,
that time, I'm ready to go to bed. But it seemed like everybody actually goes out at 1 in the morning and stays up
yeah.
until,
Those people all take drugs.
yeah,
They,
definitely.
they can't sleep. They have to party.
Yeah, it's amphetamine culture over there or something.
Well, yeah, all kinds of drugs. I mean, Berlin's a drug city. That's what actually got me started on researching drugs because drugs were everywhere. So I was kind of curious why and how did they originate and what do they mean. And, I'm also working on a keynote about my two books, Blitzed and Tripped. But I don't know yet what would be the topic. Maybe you have an idea how these books could be summed up for a keynote. What would you focus on if you were
Jeez,
me?
if I was you, that's hard to say because we're so different and our approaches would probably be different. But yeah, I don't know the dark and dirty truth about the history of drugs and the beautiful potential. Something where it's like the dark and the good. And I think we need more
Yeah,
of an honest conversation around both, which I think in your book you started to really lay out quite well in Tripped. I didn't read your other book, Blitzed. I heard you speak about it, but I was more curious about
yeah,
your other book to jump into first. But I like to hear the dirty truth because it helps people to make better decisions because I think psychedelics can be used so broadly and I think people should have the ability to use them without being fearful of being locked in a box for ex- altering their consciousness when you can have government sanctioned drugs like alcohol or whatever the drug is that they finally give you permission to use. It's like, well, what about the mushroom it's an older species than our own, and we've had a symbiotic relationship with it for all of human history, yet you can get locked in a box for it, for even having it on you in your possession. And then you need to have a victim model where if I don't have
yeah,
PTSD or trauma, I don't have
yeah,
access to a mushroom that grows in nature. I think that kind of stuff is just broadly silly. So
yeah,
I think people just need to question authority. And I think that's the thing that most people don't do. And psychedelics can actually be quite powerful tools, right? for dissolving boundaries and questioning authority, but they can also be amplified tools for oppression and for suggestibility and programming. So I think that part of the conversation is what was
Right.
missing when I started delving into this. I bought it hook, line, and sink that a politician that eats psychedelics is going to be better. And then I started to meet people that were total sociopaths and terrible people that use psychedelics on a regular basis. So I don't believe they're miracle drugs. I think they're just
Yeah.
drugs.
Yeah, they don't really make you a better person. That's true. That was Leary's idea, actually. That's where Leary can be criticized because he really thought it makes people better. And I mean, I think potentially it does because it creates new thoughts in your brain, and it's always good to have new perspectives. But it's certainly not a guarantee that you take psychedelics and then you become a better person. Probably it's probably more likely that you become a better person than a worse person. But um, basically, you're right. It's drugs are neutral.
Yeah. And I heard you briefly talking about the counterculture and how you thought MKUltra, what is your perspective on the countercultural movement and how the hippie movement developed and all that? Do you have any words on that?
I mean, Frank Zappa, and he was very smart. He said that it's all bullshit and it's all you know basically he basically would say that the LSD was spilling from the CIA into the counterculture because that was done on purpose in order to stop the counterculture from really becoming a revolutionary movement, which I think there's a lot to it. But also the counterculture is good, because it isn't a different culture, and it does change. But I understand it's just a reform, maybe. And Zappa was talking about a revolution. The revolution didn't happen, um, and I think now we get the results. Like now we're so stuck in the system that reform doesn't help anymore. I mean, we have to wake up to a totally different world. But what if we don't wake up to a totally different world? How do we get there? Um, I'm a little bit uh, I'm a little bit clueless actually about what needs to happen. And
Yeah.
the counterculture certainly didn't turn the tide, but it's better than nothing. It's good that there was at least protest against the Vietnam War, and a lot of good music came out of it at least. Um, Frank Zappa might disagree, but I think a lot of good music did come out of it.
Yeah.
So I would be interested in experiencing it, like to be in California in the late '60s. I think it would be quite interesting. Um, from now, if you could travel back now and kind of look at crucial events that happened, like the Manson murders and other things, like actually look at what really went down. A lot of it is we will probably never know.
Yeah. Yeah, I like your honest answer there, where you're like, I don't know about what we're supposed to do about that, because a lot of people are very like overconfident sometimes with their approach to some of these things, and you're like, I don't know if that's true. And it's such a messy and interest. I think it's the most interesting time in American history had to be that area
Hmm.
post World War II. The
Right.
assassination of Kennedy and the
Yeah.
development of the CIA and like the understanding of the social sciences and the mind control elements of it are so fascinating, because that's when they started to really ramp it up and experiment on
Yeah.
people and break the Nuremberg Code. And it just
Yeah.
seems so nefarious and weird.
Yeah, I mean, that's why Trip was interesting to write because I'm going into those areas. So, in a way, it's also a book about America, much more so than a book about Germany. I mean, it starts in Nazi Germany, but then the book really moves to America and examines what went down in the second part of the 20th century in the West.
Yeah. What was the most shocking stuff that you think you discovered when you were writing that book? Because I'm sure a lot of it was eye-opening for you.
I mean, for me, it's really shocking that my mother has Alzheimer and that there was no medicine available for her to take, before the disease broke out. Because I'm pretty sure that if we had legit psychedelic research going on in our universities, and in research institutions, um, 20 years down the road, we will have um, medicines which are based on psychedelic molecules that could prevent dementia. I'm pretty sure about that. That's what my research has shown so far. And that we don't do that, that we still stick to um, the old prohibitionist ways, even though we know that dementia is the pandemic of the future, with so many people, so many more people will be suffering from dementia in 20, 30 years, and that the politicians are not doing anything against that. That is pretty shocking because I see it with my own eyes when I look at my mother, and I know. I mean, we're all gonna be old, and I, I think that's quite a scandal. Um, so that is kind of what I take away from Trip,
Yeah, just the stagnant
honestly,
elements
from
of it. Yeah. I like how you said that the like biochemical walls, when you keep a drug illegal, it's like a putting up a wall inside of your consciousness. And I think that makes a lot of sense too.
it doesn't really match our understanding of living in democracies. It's a contradiction. Um, I mean, if the communists would have, when they create a wall, like the West is, very, very rightly so, pointing at it. But right now we have these walls within ourselves, and it's normal. Most people don't even know about it. So
Yeah.
that's pretty shocking.
Yeah. The initial response to this day, after all those years of propaganda to go against drugs, they just blanket statement drugs, is that you bring up that you want LSD to be used as a medicine, and people give you this horrific look as if you're crazy. And it's like, well, what are you talking about? LSD fries your brain, or psilocybin
Right.
mushrooms, or hippie drugs, or whatever it is. So it is a deeply embedded um, narrative that's stuck, and it's hard to undo those belief systems for people. And then we have walls, literal walls, where we imprison millions of people in this country alone for
Right.
minor drug offenses.
Yeah, that's pretty sad. It's a pretty sad reality in America, the prison system. We don't have it like that in Germany. I mean, America really goes to the extreme there.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really a problem.
Yeah, that's probably one of the bigger issues that I get frustrated with, is how corrupt the prison system is and how it's all tied to the war on
Yeah.
drugs. And but like you said, you're doing your best to try to bring awareness to these things so that people can start to have a different lens to view drugs in
I mean, when
general.
there was the revolution in France in 1789, the revolution started when they liberated the prison, the Bastille prison. They just overran it and released the people who were in prison, for whatever stupid reasons they had back then to put people in prisons. So certainly the prisons must open, and people who are there for doing nothing. I know of a man, Leonard Picard. He produced 95% of the world supply of LSD in the 90s. At least that's what was claimed in the court. He certainly did produce a large amount of LSD, and he got 2 life sentences for making LSD. And he's out now because he got a pardon release, but he spent, I think, 23 years, and he said he never harmed anybody. He never used violence. He was actually a Zen Buddhist, practiced Zen meditation. So that's really, like, people like that, of course, have to be released immediately from prison.
Yeah. You're friends with Leonard Picard? Because I've become aware of him in the last 10 years, and his book is on my shelf over here that he wrote in prison.
Yeah, right. No, yeah. He's a friend of mine. I visited him in New Mexico this summer, and
Cool.
we're in good contact.
Nice.
And,
He would be a fun person to learn from, because he has a perspective on the psychedelic world deeper than a lot of people think, that he's a directly tied to the CIA and somehow was used by the CIA again. But who knows? It's hard to know what's true anymore with a lot of that stuff.
yeah, you can talk to him if you want. I can make the contact.
Nice. Cool. Well, is there any place you want people to find you if they go seeking your book? They just get it on Amazon, or do you want them to go to your website? Or
My website doesn't sell books, so you have to go. I think people should go to a bookshop, but also, of course, Amazon is fine. And yeah,
cool. I like to ask
go
every
and
guest,
read.
what would you want to share with the world if you were going to die today?
Um, uh,
It's a dark question, but sort of a
if
realistic.
I would die today, what I want to share with the world? I mean, I share a lot through my books. I think take LSD at least twice a year. Everyone in the world. That's what I would like to share.
Nice. Are you talking about a bigger, like, what's your dosage if you were going to tell people that?
I think 100 microgram would be nice.
Cool.
Not too much, but not too little.
You think that would benefit people most bang for their buck?
I think so.
I like that. Right on. Cool. Well, thanks for joining me, Norman. I appreciate you. And I know we didn't really talk about the typical approach to your conversation about the book and all that, but people can do the prerequisite and go and listen to some of your
Yeah,
other stuff before they join this conversation.
right. No, I
I
thought
didn't
it
want
was
to
great.
repeat the same conversation. I like to go a little deeper into the weirder stuff. So I appreciate you
Yeah.
hanging with me today.
Thanks a lot for having me. It was a great pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you for listening to the episode. Be sure to subscribe to the show on Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes, and rate the show. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination.